And be proud of the fact that on Thursday, you didn't vote for xenophobia, you didn't vote for fear, you voted for a much better future.
Hello, I'm Dr. Mark McNaught, and I'm an Associate Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Rennes in France. Over the past several years, I've been researching Scottish and Catalan independence from a constitutional perspective, and more recently, Scotland's constitutional future post-Brexit. Given the impenetrable fog of media propaganda over Brexit, it's important to understand what leaving the European Union will actually mean for Scotland. It's safe to say that the European Union is unloved, but whatever you think of EU institutions and politicians, the legal and economic infrastructure built up over the past 40 years has allowed people like myself to study, travel, work, and flourish in other EU countries, and has been the foundation of peaceful cooperation, mutual prosperity, and free trade. Here's just a few statistics, so please bear with me. Nearly half of UK exports in goods and services go to EU countries. More than half of imports come from the EU. 7 out of the top 10 UK trading partners are EU members. In 2016, Scotland exported £12.7 billion in goods and services to the EU, not including oil and gas. So in leaving the EU, the UK goes from having free trade with the EU member states, in addition to 69 other countries through 58 free trade agreements, to zero. And any new trade agreements must be negotiated from scratch and will take many years to negotiate and ratify. It's delusional to expect that within our lifetimes, the UK can sign enough trade deals with other countries to replace a fraction of the trade lost by leaving the EU. Also, free trade agreements require trust, of which Westminster Tories have, yes, zero. In addition to obliterating trade relations with much of the world on an industrial scale, the UK will also be leaving 37 regulatory agencies and therefore no longer subject to EU regulation. I realize regulation has become a dirty word, considered by conservatives to be a drag on economic activity. However, regulations positively affect virtually every aspect of your material life. You like the water you drink to be clean, right? You like healthy, non-diseased food, right? After leaving the European Food Safety Authority, the UK is no longer bound by EU food safety law. Westminster will be desperate for trade deals to fill the gap from a position of profound weakness, and will likely sign a bargain basement trade deal with the United States, which has much lower food safety standards. Say hello to good old contaminated American chickens, washed in chlorine to kill the germs. Bon appetit. Water quality is also threatened. Scottish territory will no longer be covered by the EU Drinking Water Directive. This is especially alarming because the petrochemical giant INEOS is taking legal action to overturn the Scottish government's fracking ban, which will be much easier once the UK leaves the EU. After that, Scots can also use their sink taps as flamethrowers. UK employers will no longer be bound by the EU Working Time Directive and labour law, which protects work, health, and safety regulations. The UK is already far behind the continental states in worker protection. Brexit would remove any restraint on a Tory government eliminating worker protections entirely. Workers in Scotland will work longer hours, union rights will be curtailed even further, and safety standards will be reduced. Is that the kind of Scotland you want to work and live in? Protected status for Scottish food and drink export brands would be lost. Scotch whisky, Scottish beef and lamb, the Arbroath Smoky, and many other uniquely Scottish brands would no longer be protected. The United States and Peru have already expressed interest in producing Scotch whisky after Brexit. Scottish whisky exports are worth more than £5 billion a year, and they would be devastated by cheap imitations produced overseas, branded as Scotch. Take the airline industry, which has been regulated in the UK by the EU for decades. If there are no transitional arrangements implemented, which is entirely possible, after midnight on March 29, 2019, Airplanes will not be able to legally take off and land from UK airports. You think flying is chaotic and expensive enough as it is? Wait till March 2019. Any free trade deal signed between a post-Brexit UK and the US would inevitably lead to the privatisation and profiteering of the Scottish NHS. In England, much of it has already been sold off. Outrageously priced inadequate private insurance will replace free care, and pharmaceuticals will become much more expensive. Fancy getting a £500 bill for a visit to the doctor? For healthcare, the UK will become America's 51st state. Better get used to it. The EU has recently eliminated mobile phone roaming charges in Europe. With Brexit, kiss that goodbye. Then there's the bankers and the tax dodgers. Post-Brexit, the UK will not be subject to new EU legislation designed to tackle tax havens, which allows trillions of dollars of global profits to be hidden from governments worldwide. It's estimated that half of this money is channeled to tax havens by banks in the City of London, a private corporation with no public oversight. Once again, Scotland would be at the mercy of a few super-rich bankers who care only about profits, not the consequences for ordinary people. Brexit poses a threat not only to the devolution settlement and Scottish prosperity, but their democracy, democratic institutions, distinctive political and cultural identity, possibly even its very existence as a nation. People also need to realize that the advantages they have in Scotland, even under the current UK devolution settlement, currently being undermined by Westminster, which has allowed the Scottish government to introduce many progressive policies unavailable to the rest of the UK. Examples: bus passes for the elderly, free college tuition, free prescriptions, baby boxes, childcare, creation of a Scottish investment bank, increased infrastructure spending, and many other policies that the Westminster Tory government would never adopt. Perhaps more importantly, the Holyrood government has been able to mitigate the toxic effects of many of the monstrous Westminster policies. Fracking was banned, the ill effects of the bedroom tax and the rape clause were mitigated, and the Scottish NHS is not being flogged off to Richard Branson. These are not fictitious scare stories. It's happening now. Scottish people must act collectively, decisively, and urgently to become independent and assert their sovereignty. If not, Scotland could find itself on the road to being forever consumed by a one-nation British state before the end of 2018. Union Jacks will replace tartan and saltires not only on biscuit tins, but Scottish culture across the board. The EU desperately wants a silver lining in this Brexit fiasco. After March 2019, there is no doubt that the EU would allow an independent Scotland to remain in the customs union and single market, or some kind of holding pattern, as they have already arranged for Northern Ireland. In my view, any independence campaign should not be framed in terms of automatically staying in the EU. If Scots vote for independence before March next year, remaining in the single market will allow the Scots the time and space to collectively reflect on their relationship with the EU. Given the treatment of Catalonia by the EU Commission, Scotland may not want to join. Maybe joining the European Free Trade Agreement will be preferable. In any case, independence will restore sovereignty so Scots can decide on their own terms. So, what about Europe? What's their view? In the words of Guy Verhofstadt, chief Brexit negotiator for the EU Parliament, and I quote, "Europe hasn't forgotten that a large majority of the Scottish people voted to remain. We need the Scottish people and their firm European beliefs. Scotland has shaped European civilization through iconic figures such as David Hume, Alexander Fleming, and Adam Smith, and still does so today by being at the forefront of defining and strengthening European values. We cannot afford to lose that." Anything can happen in the meantime. The UK could well crash out with no deal, as negotiations over the status of Ireland and Gibraltar could derail the talks completely. We simply cannot predict the future, other than it will be chaotic and unpredictable. However, given the corrupt and untrustworthy Tory government, you need to plan for the worst. If Scotland does not formally declare its intention to dissolve the Union before the UK's post-Brexit plans are finalised, it will be entirely at the constitutional mercy of a British political elite intent on denying the sovereignty of the Scottish people, as well as their right to self-determination and aspirations for a better future. Scotland has to negotiate its position in or out of Europe on its own terms, not Westminster's. If not, Scotland could truly be extinguished as a nation. Scotland can choose either to remain with a Brexit UK and be one of the poorest countries in Europe, or become independent and become among its richest. It's up to you. The choice is that stark.